I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.
Welcome to Studio Sacramento. I'm your host, Scott Syfax. 2012 is an election year, and from the presidential race on down to local government, elections will decide the changes in our communities and how we live. Joining us today to make sense of the political climate and anything else that might come up are two veteran observers, Marcos Bertone, columnist with the Sacramento Bee, and Dan Moraine, editorial writer also with the Sacramento Bee. Let's start with the big story. The national elections are coming up, and the mood of the electorate is going to decide those elections. Dan, what is the mood of the electorate right now?
Well, I think people are in a very foul mood this year, maybe even probably more so than we've ever seen in our lives. In California, the unemployment rate's in excess of 11%. It's going down, but not quickly. Nationally, the unemployment rate is in excess of 8%. In our lifetimes, there's never been a president reelected with this kind of economy. So people are in a very foul mood. They think the country's on the wrong track. They think the state's on the wrong track. It's going to play out in ways, you know, we'll know soon enough, but not, we're just not going to, we haven't seen anything like this ever.
Right. And if the nation thinks that we're on the wrong track and people are in a foul mood, and the state likewise, given the amount of economic hurt in Sacramento, Marcos, is that doubly true within this region?
It is. Sacramento has been kind of like a Rust Belt city, but with better weather. The economy has been such that it's really affected people's moods. Traditionally a government town, with a shrinking sector of government jobs, a shrinking amount of opportunities, mobility, movement, and it has created this stagnation, and it affects people in a really negative way in that there's a real pessimistic kind of undertone to all things in Sacramento, and there has been for a while, where people, and it plays out in our online comments on Sacramento.com, people are just cranky about anything and everything, and where you used to be able to, like in my job, you used to be able to write pieces about people who are facing tough times or maybe who have a poignant story, and it used to be you'd get a really nice phone call or phone calls, and then later on emails. Now you get really cranky comments where people's sympathy levels are at a pretty low level, and it's going to...
Because if I've got problems, why am I going to help you?
Why do I care about you?
Yeah.
Why should I care about you? And that's Sacramento. That's where Sacramento is right now from a mentality standpoint, is people aren't concerned about your problems because they have problems.
Well, you know, that goes to a point that seems to be pervasive throughout the country. I want to read you a quote from an issue of Time magazine. It says, "America's story, our national mythology, is built on the idea of having an opportunity society. From the tales of Horatio Algiers to the real lives of Henry Ford and Mark Zuckerberg, we have defined our country as a place where everyone, if he or she works hard enough, can get ahead." There's a growing sense, Dan, that the system no longer works and that it's broken, and that, as more importantly, that the people that we elect and that supposedly serve us to run the wheels of our government, they're either incapable, incompetent, or there's no fresh ideas as to how to get us back to where it is that we think that upward mobility still exists.
Well, you know, I don't think people look to government to solve their problems unless they're really in difficult straits, right? But by and large, I think people go about their business and don't give government a lot of thought, which is good, because if you think about it,
well, isn't that
it'll
the way
scare
it's supposed
you.
To be?
Right. Right.
Like
Yeah,
oxygen
sure.
everywhere and is there for you to breathe?
Yeah, you don't want to think about government. You want government to do its job and go about its
So
business.
are we thinking about government too much these days?
Well, I do in my line of work, but I hope the people watching this aren't. You know, I hope they're unless they've got a real issue, you know, they're in need of the safety net. That I just don't think you can look to government to solve California's problems or in a real sense the country's problems. I mean, it's going to come from within.
But on a real note, in terms of what we tend to hold dear to ourselves as Americans, that opportunity is evergreen in this society, is part of the anger and resentment that the electorate is feeling right now. How does the thought that maybe the good times are not as assured of coming back as in the past, how does that play in, Marcos?
Well, I don't want to let all of us off the hook completely, okay? Because we went through a period, particularly here in Sacramento, where we were living pretty high on the hog, where housing was booming, and where, okay, I would be the first to say, for example, that the banks deserve a ton of scorn, and you've had guests on this show who've spoken to that very eloquently, much more so than I ever could. And I agree with all that. However, we were all running up our credit cards, were we not?
Yes, we were.
Yes, we were. We were all, many of us, many people were taking out loans that they really couldn't afford for houses that they really shouldn't have been in. And so, guess what? It hasn't worked out. It hasn't worked out. The no interest loan, well, maybe it has a big balloon payment that comes up. And so the bill came due, and we're mad about it. We're mad that the bill came due. And so I don't want to be the skunk at the picnic here, but I do feel that, okay, we can be upset about a lot of things that have happened, particularly in this region, when there's no movement and we're in double-digit unemployment, people are hurting, and I see that every day in my life. But there should be, to sort of move forward, maybe some acknowledgement that many of us were benefiting from it and were maybe living beyond our means, and the bill came due, and we just don't like that feeling.
Okay.
Well, and we've got, you know, there certainly are real issues. I mean, you look at UC tuition. You know, I know, you know, this is something about which I'm an expert, as my kids will tell you. This is,
So
you
this
know,
is real for you.
This is, you know, this is $25,000 a year. This is a lot of money. Now, you know, it would be more at a private university, but I mean, this is something to confront. And if you're doing that on your own, right? I mean, if you're a working stiff, you know, how do you come up with that kind of money? You know, it's not easy. So I think, you know, the college kids these days, especially those who are putting themselves through school, this is, you know, this is a real issue. And you come out of school with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. That affects how the job you're looking for, right? You're not going to go into public service necessarily if you've got $100,000 law school debt. You know, you're going to go to work for a corporate law firm if you can.
Well, sure. And it speaks to, though, the big issues for this year. You know, we've seen protests at college campuses. We had one locally that you wrote about. We've seen a lot of discussion about how the safety net that we were discussing a little bit earlier is framed, and that there's no money. There is no money. What are the big issues that are going to be talked about this year?
Well, you know, as we started, it's an election year, so everything in politics revolves around elections, right? So we've got every member of the assembly up for election, half the Senate. Many of them are running for Congress. There are going to be several open congressional seats in California. So it's a big issue, and that will affect everybody's vote on every bill.
But let's take one
that,
issue. Let's take one issue. For instance, we are in the process at the state level of releasing a ton of prisoners.
Well, it's a huge issue.
Well, give us a little bit of background on that.
Well, so 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the estimate was that by now we'd have in excess of 200,000 inmates in California prisons. I mean, we never reached that point,
Because
but
of
we did
3
reach, because of 3 strikes and other laws. I mean, there were in excess of 100 laws that were passed in the early 90s and late 80s that extended criminal sentences. We never reached that, but we did hit 174,000. I mean, it's a huge number of inmates. It was unsustainable. As prison population grew, the amount of money that the state spent on prisons expanded. It was never enough. The court stepped in and concluded that in order to make the prisons constitutional, you either had to build a bunch more or you had to release a bunch of prisoners. So now, instead of 174,000, we're down to 130,000 inmates, and it's going to go down further. Now, where do those people go?
Yeah.
They're walking on K Street. They're in downtown LA. And you know, these are supposedly not heavyweight felons, but they've all got a felony record, otherwise they wouldn't be in prison to begin with. And many of them are mentally ill. I mean, this is going to be a big issue for us.
If we look at this, and you've got mentally ill folks, you've got this huge release of prisoners, and we've got a local government that's straining just to provide basic services throughout this region, how are we going to afford the big ticket items that we're looking at right now? You know, we've got a big sewer system redo. There's things having to do with air quality that are going to have to be addressed. We're looking at an arena. How's all that going to factor in when you've got this deluge of responsibilities from the state coming down to the local level?
Well, in terms of the prisoners coming in, it's exacerbated by a local police union in Sacramento that refuses to pay into their pension the way the rest of us do. And so at first 42 officers went away. They've been able to bring some of them back. But so you have that political dynamic of a interest group that refuses to do what everybody else does, which is to pay into the union. So have exacerbated a law enforcement issue. With respect to the obligations that Sacramento has on the water treatment, they're going to have to borrow. And that's it. That's all they can borrow. So, for example, the issue that's taken up a lot of ink in the Sacramento Bee has been this whole issue of an arena in Sacramento, revitalizing downtown. Sacramento can't borrow for that. So you borrow for water treatment, borrow for the arena. You know, borrow for water treatment and other services, or borrow for the arena. So some other third party is going to have to come up with the money to fill out the arena, and that's it. And we have to accept that. Not that we have to, but we're forced to accept that there are obligations and services that we would like to have, but that we can no longer have. And even to the extent of not having the law enforcement that we should have, not because we can't, but because we can't afford it, partly because the police officers themselves don't want to pay into their own pensions.
And when you balance all those issues, what are the topics that are not getting enough necessarily ink or airtime that are going to be of critical importance this year?
Well, look, I mean, locally, the issue that doesn't get enough airtime, and I plead guilty to this myself, is identifying opportunities for development of business, of job creation, and I take responsibility for my part of this, is not holding the politicians accountable enough for not focusing on that. I mean, we are in the bedrock union labor in Sacramento, and from the state level to the local level, almost exclusively Democrats, and they're focused on social issues and dealing with their constituents. And that's it. They'll talk a nice game about creating job opportunities, but when you sort of talk to them in terms of specifics, there are no specifics. And so we end up having a region of government-related employment and people in nonprofits. We need for-profits.
Well, there's a effort right now within this region called Next Economy, and I know that they've come before the editorial board at the Bee, and there's been some reporting in the Bee about this group. And just full disclosure, I sit on that committee as well. That is exactly charged with trying to grow and diversify Sacramento's entrepreneurial and business base. And when I say Sacramento, I'm not talking about the city, I'm talking about the region as a whole. We do have assets that we can double down on. We've got a strong university, we've got a vibrant agricultural sector, a vibrant healthcare sector, and the like. Is there a mentality, though, in this town that is so government-based and so focused because of being the seat of the legislature and the like, that we really can't get past ourselves in terms of those issues are so easy for us to focus on because they're so familiar that we can't really get to job creation?
Well, I would ask those who are studying, the entrepreneurial spirit, whether they're entrepreneurs themselves,
Sure,
or whether they work in government or are nonprofits. Number one, and number two, we're a kind of a region of people who are really good at diagnosing what ails us. But when you ask that, and I've been asking this question for months now. Okay, so what do you do? What do you mean? What do you? Yeah, what should we do? How do we fix this? That's where the problem is. Mm-hmm. Where you just asking the simple question, okay, what do you do in Sacramento to promote job creation? There's no, I haven't heard a clear answer yet. And from very smart people, universities and we have a private sector here in Sacramento. We have some of the most shy, bashful, rich people that I have ever seen. Everyone has their own little thing. We have, and I'm not going to name any names now, but just familiar names of people who are known to be doing well. Nobody wants to kind of stick their neck out and propose something for fear of getting lashed out at from union leaders or whatever, or from commenters in Sacramento.
We don't celebrate success and wealth is one comment that I've heard a lot, that because of sort of a government town mentality, we like sameness across the board. And people who are outliers in terms of success and start to show that success, they're immediately identified and punished, so to speak. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But I guess where I would go with that is a couple of events have happened. Waste Management, one of our largest corporations, billion-dollar corporation, leaving town.
Waste Connections.
Or Waste Connections.
Yeah.
And the comment is regulatory just thicket that cannot be pushed through makes Sacramento, makes California X% more expensive to do business in.
Well,
what is that conversation that's going on at the state level?
Well, I actually think Waste Connections had multiple reasons for leaving, but probably one of the biggest reasons, I mean, it's 100 jobs, so it's not, it's certainly not a make or break for this region. It's unfortunate that they left. But, they're moving to a state that has no income tax. And so if you're the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation and you don't have to pay state income tax, well, that's probably significant to you, right? And also, I think in their instance, they're trying to grow on the East Coast, and they're heavy in the South already. And so if you're based in California, it makes it a little bit difficult, right? So Dallas, the Woodlands area where they've relocated, makes sense for them geographically.
Yeah, but the essential question is, what is it that at the state level, is this a topic of conversation that people are likely to take meaningful action on in 2012?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed about Governor Brown is he's very focused on environmental regulation and seems rather annoyed by environmental regulation. So in my view, he would be willing to roll back regulation. I'm not sure the legislature is necessarily going to go along with that, but I do think that that's certainly going to be an issue in the legislature this year and the following year. So yeah, absolutely. Environmental regulation is an issue. He's focused on, he talks about it all the time. So.
Scott, I think part of it too is, and I really see this here in Sacramento, there's no dynamic tension in Sacramento. This is the bluest of blue states, and so there's no alternative, either in Sacramento City or in the state of California, to kind of push back against politicians who are in a comfort zone to just be able to deal with their constituents being organized labor. And it falls on the state Republican Party of being so completely inept to be unable to provide an alternative. And I fault them extremely for being so idiotic to not try to cultivate Hispanic candidates. You have a state that is becoming increasingly Hispanic by the minute, and culturally and politically, you have people who are predisposed to be Republican. But if you're
From a
going
cultural
to, from a
standpoint.
cultural standpoint, and people, a community that is steeped in faith and country
Family.
family, it should be right up their alley. And yet, you got to bang the immigration drum every single day, and you have to do it in such an idiotic way that you force this group of people to feel defensive about it, even though they're not illegal. But the Republican Party is speaking about immigration in a way to make it seem like anybody who's brown is suspect.
Let me get Dan in on this because
I think
Matt Rexroad came on this show a couple of months ago, and we were talking about the redistricting, and he essentially said that the Republican Party in California is sliding toward irrelevancy. I can't see how a major political party in this nation could allow itself to slide toward irrelevancy. But when I hear Marcos's words, how does that make sense?
Well, you see it in California's U.S. Senate race. I mean, who's the Republican who's going to run against Dianne Feinstein?
I haven't heard of one.
She's going to get all but a free ride, which is stunning. It's absolutely stunning. I mean, this is a state that not very long ago had, a Republican senator and Republican governors, and
In fact, there's
it's
no
not
statewide
just
office holder, right? that
no
is a
statewide
Republican.
office holder, and I mean, if I couldn't name one who I think could run for governor in 3 years. I mean, no name comes to mind. And I'm not that smart, but if I talk to smart people, they don't know who's going to run for governor. It's not just the cultural issues, and it's not just Latinos, Asian Americans. One of the big issues with new Americans is the possibility of moving up. And so in order to do that, you need good public schools and good public universities. And every time tuition goes up and every time class size goes up, it affects new Americans.
Well, you wrote recently that, in fact, in the past 4 years, public spending at the state level in education has decreased from $60 billion down to $50 billion.
How do you sustain that? And it's not as if population's shrinking, right? And it's not as if the population of children is shrinking. Right? So, in fact, the attendance will be going down because of demographics, but this is a big issue. This is something that we all have to contemplate. How are we going to deal with this as a state and as a society?
Well, yeah, because it's those young people that are going to support us when it is that we're of retirement age. Well, hopefully that assumes that we're ever going to be able to retire.
Yeah.
And so let's go back to local issues just quickly in our last few minutes. What are the other big issues you're going to be following locally in 2012?
Well, I mean, we've only touched on it just slightly, but two things locally, both related to Mayor Kevin Johnson, is that his attempts to enhance his powers, and at the same time, to essentially get rid of, the 2 or 3 people who have been thorns in his side on the city council. And so that whole issue got wrapped up because, frankly, mistakes that he made got wrapped up in his personality and just the fact that he was so despised coming in by the local power base because he ruined their little plan. They all had his people all lined up, and they had all agreed amongst themselves that this is the way it was going to be, and he came in and ruined it. The other issue, obviously, is whether the Sacramento Kings will remain, and Waste Connections, obviously. So the fact that Waste Connections was the largest publicly traded company in Sacramento. No offense to them, doesn't exactly reflect well on Sacramento, but losing the Sacramento Kings would be very detrimental, and we're going to find out very quickly if they're going to remain or not.
Well, redevelopment, K Street.
Redevelopment,
You
yes.
know, it's an issue that flows from the state directly to the localities. You know, the state can't afford to help refurbish K Street. But if you're the mayor and the city council in Sacramento, you've got to figure out a way to keep to encourage development where you know, where entrepreneurs aren't necessarily going to go.
Right. In our last 30 seconds, I wanted to ask you both for a prediction. Something that you think of significance, positive or negative, that will happen in 2012. Dan, let's start with you.
Well, you know, I think Americans elect as this sort of third way of,
You have about 10 seconds.
of electing a president. I think it's going to have an impact on the presidential
Okay.
campaign.
Marcos, you got 5 seconds.
Real positive. Things will get better this year.
All right. Well, thank you both. Very, very interesting conversation, and I'd like to invite you both to come back on at a later time. Well, that's our show. Thanks to our guests, Marcos Bertone and Dan Moraine of the Sacramento Bee. There's lots of talk on television, but only a few places where the conversations matter. I'm Scott Syfax, and you've been watching Studio Sacramento. Join us next time, right here on KVIE.
I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.